So Beaver in a lot of systems were native, and in those systems where they did not have adequate water depth to provide them protection from predators and provide underwater entrances to their lodges, they build dams, and that's a really important thing to think about in terms of condition. There's been a lot of enthusiasm about beaver. This is Beaver Restoration Guidebook on the left here, paper we wrote with Michael Pollock on using beaver dams to restore and size streams. And one of the things that what we were really concerned about was how to temper some of that enthusiasm constructively and provide more realistic expectation management for where beaver and dam building activity might be something that is natural versus possible, allowable, desirable, etc. And ultimately, in the context of ecohydraulics, whether or not that's something that could help with fish populations. So, what BRAT does, the Beaver Dam Restoration Assessment Tool, is resolves where and to what level within a drainage network beaver dams can be built and sustained. The Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool is all about how many beaver dams, not about how many beaver. How many beaver is a really interesting but much more difficult problem. Beaver are an undiscriminating rodent, and so the problem with them is they can survive in so many different places. However, beaver dams, where they manipulate the environment to deepen water for their benefit, for their survival, that's a much more restrictive range of conditions where they impact those systems and act as an ecosystem engineer. So the primary questions in the capacity part of the BRAT tool model that we ask is, and by capacity we mean what's the capacity of the riverscape to support dam building activity? How many beaver dams could it squeeze in it? Is there enough water present to maintain a pond? Are enough and the right type of woody resources present to support dam building? Can they build a dam at base flows? And are those dams likely to withstand typical floods? Now you can just go and use your brain, and we could even give you a little inference system, a table, a rule table, and you could answer these questions with evidence that you see on the ground and some common sense. And you can apply that inference system, and you can use this thought process, and it's a really helpful planning tool at every individual reach. But what we're interested in is modeling every single reach in an entire drainage network. So how can we approximate answers to these questions with some freely available national data? Well, we've got NHD, and NHD, the National Hydrologic Data Set, maps where perennial streams are. And so that could address this question of water, right? We've also got land fire that maps vegetation type. Yeah, you could get a better vegetation map, but you're not at this point going to have it everywhere. Land fire is consistently produced everywhere in the lower 48. USGS produces regional curves that give us baseflow statistics as well as estimates of typical high floods. And those, combined with the National Elevation Data Set, might allow us to derive slope, and then stream power is slope times discharge, and so we can look at can they build a dam at base flow, and are dams likely to withstand typical floods in terms of estimates of stream power. So the capacity model in a nutshell is beaver need water and wood to build dams. The type and extent of wood vegetation matters most, and then the flow regime potentially acts to limit that capacity. And so we look at vegetation immediately adjacent to and within a 100-meter buffer of the channel. And then we get an initial estimate of how many dams based off of vegetation alone could be rebuilt. Then we filter that down by things like the base flow stream power. So this is mapped in terms of taking stream power and asking the question, can they build a dam at base flow? Yes, they absolutely can in blue. Green, they probably can. And red, no, we don't think so. We can also look at that at peak flows, whether or not the dam is likely to persist, occasionally breach, occasionally blow out, or pretty much always blow out. And so these collectively can act to adjust these capacity estimates. We also adjust for the areas that are so flat that they don't need that many dams, right? If you build a meter-high dam in a really, really flat reach, it backs up for half a mile. And so you just don't need the same density of dams. And an upper limit on slope, which the literature will suggest is 5 to 7%. That's nonsense. We have a bunch of empirical evidence of beaver building in the above 10% range. In fact, we have some beaver up to 23% slope, and the density actually even goes up in some of those high slope areas. And so we go that so we have that in there as well. And then drainage area, if you get to a big enough river, and at least on the main anabranch of that big river, sometimes they'll dam on side channels, but the main anabranch, they won't. So we get an overall score of capacity. And so if you pull this out to a bigger regional scale, or this example, a statewide scale, we can do things like map what the capacity is to support dam building activity. And here, we've got an existing capacity in this area of 356,000 dams that could be there. That's an average of about 8.3 dams per kilometer. And what we find is that we are hugely under capacity if you actually go and map those beaver dams. There's a lot more beaver that could be supported in these landscapes. So I'm going to walk you through a case study to just sort of show the capacity model that we talked about and some of the other really important parts of BRAT for expectation management. Okay, so here's a little basin up in the Wyoming called the Popeighy. This is a map of beaver dam capacity based off of existing conditions. So where could beaver be supported now? This is a map based off of historic conditions. So notice the contrast between those two, right? So what do you think is happening? Well, in this band here in the middle of the watershed, there's clearly been some impacts that are limiting things, okay? And so that in and of itself is useful. Now, just because beaver can do good doesn't mean that they, from a human perspective, they always do good. There's a lot of places where they can cause problems. And it turns out we have maps of the sorts of things where beavers could cause problems. In green, I'm showing you where valley bottoms are. In black, I've got roads in this basin mapped. In red, I've got railroads. And then in light blue, I have canals. All of which, not the green, the valley bottoms, but the rest of it, are places where beaver may not be the best thing. Okay, so we could start with a really conservative look. We could just map, this has nothing to do with beaver, but just map for all of these riverscapes, how far away is the water body from roads, railroads, crossings, or canals, and just have this logic of, well, the closer, the higher the probability of conflict. Okay, and this isn't accounting for beaver activity or for tolerance. But we might be smarter to focus on specific threats. Right? So let's, if we're talking to irrigators, let's talk exactly about actual canals shown in red, or, whether you're in the canal or you're pretty much at a point of diversion, or you're within the normal forage range of beaver, within their plausible forage range, or so far away that it's really outside the range of concern. Okay? And so those can be some pretty helpful ways of looking at things. We could also focus on where do the roads intersect the drainage network and look at, are we at or near a crossing, within the vicinity of a crossing, or not at all close to that crossing. Now, if we take some of those specific threats, right, and a map like this is helpful, just like a map like this is helpful, right, because it pinpoints the conversation. Instead of it just being, well, beaver are going to mess everything up and they're a real problem, let's talk about the specific things that you're concerned about and map where they are. Clearly, if we're up in this part of the basin, which happens to be wilderness in the Wind River Range, not an issue we need to think about. But if we're in these parts of the basin, yeah, okay, we might need to think about it. But what we can do is combine that with the capacity model and look at, well, where are beaver likely to build dams? And so if we look at areas of potential undesirable impacts from beaver dam activity, um, then we can take this and we can really constrain this and pinpoint to very specific locations where, yeah, these are the areas we need to keep an eye on. The rest of this, either because capacity is low, or you can take it a step further and look at where actual beaver activity is, are things we don't need to lose sleep about. And so you can use this to come up with potential management zones. I'm going to leave this out for just a second, and I'll come back to this. But we can also identify the areas where there's low capacity and why. Is it something that's naturally limited, or is it something that's anthropogenically limited? And then, if we basically remove the areas that are of concern and we look at areas where there's potential for restoration, the green are low-hanging fruit areas where there's higher capacity, and you could do this right away. The quick returns are areas where you might need to do a little restoration, but the potential is there, versus long-term possibility is more, historic, and if the will is there, you might decide to do it. And so you can have these sorts of management models that look at immediate returns, long-term gains, etc. And so that's one of the things that BRAT can do for you. All right. In the next video, we're going to transition out of stuff related to trying to estimate conditions and geomorphology, and talk a little bit more broadly about the whole suite of Riverscape consortium models.